this is work that has been done by Zainab Sayeda, Divyanshu Kukreti, and Soumya Sagarika, and I, as their manager, am just going to take credit for it. I will send you a link to the published version of this work. This was done in early April, so it's a study of about 243 stories from various fact checkers. We will do an update later this coming week of about 550 or so stories, which look at how these patterns have changed since then. And what I'll do right now to give you an overview is that there is a misinformation landscape which we are all aware of. Many of the people here are people who work in misinformation. So you have a sense of the fact that there is health-related misinformation, economic misinformation, and political misinformation as three broad boxes of misinformation. And the interesting thing about COVID is that it's obviously health related, but it's actually all three. And which is why it has really captured the imagination of everyone in terms of what the news cycle is running. And as a result, the bulk of misinformation that we see right now, it's almost the overwhelming amount of misinformation. In fact, the coming week, one of the stories we'll do is we'll show how misinformation has changed. And essentially now almost all the misinformation is COVID related. And even when it's not COVID related, it tends to have some COVID component to it. So we know from past work, for example, that health-related issues cause spikes in health-related misinformation. So, for instance, I guess the Boom Life folks can probably confirm this, is that monsoons or flu seasons, these drive up the amount of health-related misinformation, even if they're not specifically about the flu. So there is that relationship between what's happening in the world and what kind of misinformation gets out there. Right, economic crises, likewise, we know from, for instance, from the past that the Yes Bank crisis caused a spike in economic misinformation. So there is that relationship of the news cycle with what kind of misinformation there's happening, and that's what really helps us understand why COVID was such a driver. So this talk isn't about why this misinformation happens, who's driving this misinformation per se. That's things that perhaps people at Boom Life could probably answer much better. I mean, there are economic incentives to misinformation. There are pure mischief incentives to misinformation. And there is, of course, political affective drivers of misinformation as well. And we are not necessarily in a position to comment about what those are. What we will try to do here is to see how this misinformation connects to certain social constructs and certain social constructs specific to the times that we are seeing right now. Okay. Now, first up, misinformation. This is a graph on COVID-related misinformation, starting from Jan 23rd, which is when the first misinformations around COVID started appearing in India. Now, this is the time when there was the major news cycle driving this was returning Kerala, students from Kerala who were returning from Wuhan. And that's when the COVID misinformation cycle really starts starting. And an important point is that these are misinformation that has been debunked by Indian fact checkers and a small number of Indian fact checkers, and I'll go through that in a bit. And that means that we don't necessarily know if there was some misinformation which was running in encrypted platforms, because that's not necessarily easily available to everyone. And these they may or may not have actually necessarily gone viral to the point that a fact checker thought of checking it. So we see clearly that over here that there is misinformation. This is a cumulative graph, so it doesn't have some of the burstiness that Arches's graph did. It's a clever little visual trick to make it seem more smooth. What we see is that there's a kind of a flattening out in Feb, where there isn't that much talk about, there isn't that much misinformation about COVID, and then suddenly in the second week of March it takes off, and it actually not only takes off here. Right now we're just actually, I'd hope that we'd be able to do the graphs of all the way till last week, but it has continued this very strong upward trajectory of stories since then. Really starting with when the prime minister did his first talk about misinformation, and when chief ministers started shutting down states, and then has kept this upward trajectory since then, right? A couple of interesting tidbits over here. There has been discussion that Rahul Gandhi was the first person to talk about COVID. Actually, it was Shivraj Chauhan. He was the first person to actually first major leader to talk about COVID. But Rahul Gandhi was the first person to actually to highlight for at a national level like how important it is to get a hang of this right now. So in fact, even before Rahul Gandhi, Shashi Tharoor had already started talking about it. The important point here is that what drives the news on Twitter, and incidentally, Twitter is what we study, is not when one leader talks about it, but when a set of leaders start talking about it online. And that is almost always driven by the head of the party or some critical figure talking about it in a consistent way. Now, in the BJP, that did not take off until Narendra Modi started talking about it, and then a bunch of other BJP leaders started talking about it. And then, of course, COVID was a huge trending topic within BJP leaders, right? In Congress, these are the two parties that we looked at in terms of their misinformation, their engagement with COVID. When the smaller leaders talked about it, it didn't take off. When Rahul Gandhi talked about it the first time, there was a bunch of Congress leaders who talked about it. Then he discussed it again a second time. Then again, there's the burst of leaders, and I'm happy to send links to these stories that we did on leaders and misinformation and discussion of COVID. But it wasn't actually what Rahul Gandhi did, and often has to do with tweeting patterns, is that he talked about it once and then stopped talking about it. He doesn't consistently talk about things, and therefore the Congress leaders also talked about it once and then disappeared. What Narendra Modi did was he actually started talking about COVID and then kept talking about COVID. And as a result, there was a huge Twitter news cycle or hashtag cycle driven by Narendra Modi. And you can actually tell which are the ruling party driven Twitter hashtags. For instance, India fights Corona, Orissa fights Corona, whatever. These are the standard suffix of fights Corona are tend to be driven by the ruling party. And the point is that these were very consistently pushed since mid-March, and that also is some kind of an indicator of the fact that this has become news. It is becoming news not only in your daily newspaper, that's all you can see on television, and of course obviously online. And so that then coincides with how the misinformation flows. Now, what we did is that there is this company called Tattle Civic Technologies. Essentially, what they do is they maintain an archive of various organizations which are debunking stories, and they store them. And we took their data and looked at 6 IFCN certified fact checkers, including Boom Life, and and coded all their stories based on 7 categories. Now, these 7 categories were arrived at iteratively. Earlier, we had different sets of categories, and then we figured that those categories didn't necessarily always make sense. We have these 7 now. Now, over time, these 7 might change. But there are a few things which are important about these, and I'll explain these very, very briefly. So the first category is culture. It's a broadish catch-all category which is about misinformation, which refers to either popular culture or to a specific cultural ethnic group. um, Misinformation about Chinese people and Chinese practices, for instance, that would be one case of cultures. Again, something that arches highlighted in his brief discussion, which is when this crisis started, a lot of the misinformation was about Chinese people, Chinese practices, was about Chinese wet markets. But these things quickly became, well, there was obviously a cultural element about them by virtue of being about China, but they also became cultural in the sense of there were stories which were then driving how meat eating culture is related to viruses and how vegetarianism therefore is not, and so on and so forth. So there were these cultural points um, which we clubbed into one body. Another one was about cure, prevention, and treatment, and this is obvious, as you can imagine. This is about what might cure the virus. The third was about nature and environment. Some of these were about the causes, but an interesting trend that we saw around the middle of April was there was a number of stories which I'm sure all of you have also seen about how the first trend of nature-related stories was things about how animals have caused this and that humans interfering with the animal world has driven this. There may be some truth to some of those things, but in general, there was a huge amount of misinformation around that. And after that, there started being misinformation around how animals have started taking over again. So there's more birds, there's goats and tigers roaming the streets. There was even one about mermaids being seen again. So this was about generally nature and the environment. The fourth we have here is casualty, and casualty by this we mean messages related to deaths and severe cases of COVID. This is not including statistics, which means that these are graphic messages about people who are suffering the condition. So you see a huge number of these at various points, very graphic images of people who have passed away or people who are suffering, and that's misinformation, mainly intended to shock you into some position, some form of thinking about this as coming for you. The next set is about business and the economy. These are messages related to, say, how the economy is doing or how it might do post-COVID. The sixth is about government and institutions, and these are messages about how governments around the world are dealing with this. Again, we see a spike in this after Modi's address, which we'll talk about why that happens. And the last is doctored statistics, which means how many millions of people have been affected by this, statistics for specific areas, and so on and so forth. All right. So these are the broad categories. As I say, uh, the challenge with doing qualitative research is that someone else who did the exact same set of analyses might come up with slightly different categories. And so, which is why we did this in two batches with two different sets of researchers to see what they would come up with. There were clear intersections in some and disagreements with some, and therefore this is the last 7 that we've come up with. As I say, it is entirely possible that 6 months down the line we'll come up with a new set of categories. But the point with these is we've tried as far as possible to make these mutually exclusive in their primary coding, which means that when somebody sits down and looks at a story, they're allowed to assign only one of these, even if if one story might have actually elements of more than one. And so for that, we use a second layer of coding, which is tagging of stories with what are the specific items included in that story. So one story might be, say, about doctored statistics. If the story says, for example, that West Bengal has 7 million active cases and Mamata Banerjee is hiding this. Now, in that case, this would be a story categorized under doctored statistics, but the keywords would include Mamata Banerjee because she is a key person in that, and West Bengal would also be one of the category, tags in that, right? So then that's that. Okay, the way that these are done is there are two coders who look at every story, and then they have to have agreement on a story as being one in one of those categories, and we measure what kind of agreement they have. And if they don't have agreement, then an arbitrator then looks at whether uh, which category it should fall into. Another key aspect is stories can be positive or negative. So there can be stories, generally a lot of misinformation tends to be negative, which is scaring people or telling them some falsehood about uh, some situation or another. But a great example of where positive misinformation often comes is in politics, where uh, you might have seen a lot of information about one or another politician as being voted the best politician in the world, and that's untrue. But it's trying to cast somebody in positive light rather than trying to cast them in negative light. Okay, so there's a couple of graphs I'll run through. I know I'm trying to go in the next 2 or 3 minutes wrap up so that you can ask me questions, which is what were the categories of misinformation based on their novelty. Now there are two basic types of misinformation. One is based on new content, which is that the person who's creating the misinformation comes up with something, and then they create a message out of it. And the second is a mix of fabricated content. So one is a completely new content, the other is reconfigured content. So then you've taken an image from somewhere else and reconfigured it and put it out there out of context and done something like that, right? And when we look at these across the different categories that we've come across, you see a couple of very interesting patterns here. One of them is that that casualty related, and I don't know if you can see my cursor. Can you? No? Yes? All right. So casualty related misinformation tends to be highly reconfigured, and culture related misinformation also tends to be highly reconfigured. And the reason for this is that casualty is something where you actually want some graphic content, you want to shock someone, and if that graphic content is based on something that is not true, then you basically take some other graphic content from somewhere and say this is how corona hurts your body or whatever, right? So and culture related content also has the same element, which is that uh, there are there are old events which are or different events entirely, which are then brought in here, reconfigured, and made it look like as though this is actually culture related. Now, doctored statistics, obviously they're new, tend to be new content because you're kind of creating this out of nowhere. Same thing with cure and prevention, that this content tends to be new because you're kind of inventing it, right? So the kind of content and the intent of the content have a relationship, is the point I'm making over here. The second point is that the mode of propagation, um, and by mode of propagation I mean is the material video, text, images, or audio, and we've obviously looked at all of these. Audio related misinformation tends to be slightly on the lower side in these platforms, but then there are other platforms such as I don't know if people have heard of things like CGNet Swara, and places where it is primarily audio driven, where that's the only thing that you're looking for. This is interesting because again it refers to how you create affect in the reader and how you scare them or what have you. And again you see there are some patterns over here, even though it's less obvious than in the than in the previous figure. The real interesting thing I want to point out is how much of the yellow you have in these graphs. So the yellow is text, versus the green is video, and the blue and the red is visual images, right? Now, when you're presenting doctored statistics, if you see doctored statistics, which is out here, you generally tend to have more yellow, more text, and cure and prevention also you generally tend to have slightly more text, because you have to give some kind of an explanation which is not just emotional. And this is a very important point that I come to later on, which is whether the misinformation is primarily affective or emotive, or primarily fact based, and like obviously false fact based. So when you're presenting something which is cure, you're actually presenting something which is fact based. You're trying to convince somebody that drinking garlic juice or whatever is going to cure you, so you have to give some kind of facts behind that. Versus when you say that that Muslims are spreading misinformation, COVID, that's still misinformation, but that primarily tries to get at you affectively. Now, the culture related stuff tends to be highly video, and the casualty stuff, as you can see, is entirely video or images, because the shock value of the image is what matters. Whereas when people are trying to convince you of doctors, or whoever people or whoever is doing the misinformation is doing these doctored statistics or cure, they tend to rely a little bit more on text. And actually there's very interesting patterns to the text. If you look through the text, you'll find that there is often very specific information, like you have to gargle at 98 degrees Fahrenheit to do this, and the kinds of things that you actually just never see a doctor telling you, is like, boil this to 98 degrees Fahrenheit and then do it. So there are those patterns, and you see that in how the misinformation is spread. Okay, there are attributed sources. I'm not going to go into these too much, but misinformation often will try to find a fake source, which the story can be attributed back to. The most important place where this tends to happen is in doctored statistics or in government related misinformation, where you'll have a clear a fake kind of letterhead from where the story is coming, or an attribution. Okay, Rajnikant has said that this is happening, and then if you believe everything Rajnikant says, then you say, okay, fine, if Rajnikant has said, then I'll believe it, right? So we also code who is the attributed source of a certain story. Okay, so this is a continuation of the story. Can you see? Well, I think you can't probably see the end of my image, but the point is that misinformation. We did a fortnightly classification of misinformation starting from January all the way to April, and this is the 2 weeks starting on this date. And so essentially what we see over here is that generally you're not looking at a lot of action till mid-March, and then suddenly in mid-March there's a huge spike. Actually, the date over here is the mid date, so it's 1 week before 16th March, 1 week after 16th March, and that's how this graph has been put together. And then essentially you see a huge spike in culture related misinformation, and then of course government also becomes big. And the reason for this is that cure based misinformation, which sees a fall, is cure-based misinformation. You can't continue to fool people on if the cure is going to show up to be fake. I mean, if you give me garlic water and then that garlic water doesn't do anything, then that gets debunked pretty quickly right there, right? And what has also been happening is that the misinformation has been countered by a lot of key people. In fact, Narendra Modi himself coming on television and saying that there is no cure makes a difference to if you're equally inclined to believe Narendra Modi and Ayurvedic cure, then you have to actually pick between one of the two, and then now your leader is telling you that, well, this doesn't really work. And so then there is a drop in cure related misinformation as more and more prominent leaders start saying that there is no cure. And there is, of course, then a move from that to something which is more affective and emotional, which is based on what actually I think Govind very eloquently referred to, that there is uh, an ecosystem which already allows for you to believe that that all your problems are caused by this particular villain, which is in this case Muslims, and therefore there was this huge spike in misinformation around Tablighi Jamaat and what happened after that, which is that the stories were that these were coming from Muslim communities trying to spread misinformation, COVID throughout the country. So that is a pattern which actually we see continuing even after the mid April, when Tablighi Jamaat has, for the most part, actually dropped out of the news. And you can see this very clearly in the three graphs that we've pulled out here. And again, Venkatesh, I can send you a link to the story, and you can post it to the people who are on the call. Which is if you look at word clouds of 3 points at which these misinformation was coming out. You see, in the first word cloud, there is various kinds of things. There is a bit of Janta curfew, and these are culture related. These are general misinformation in 3 parts. There is stuff about the lockdown. There's stuff about meat, and so on and so forth. And by the second image, you've started seeing a lot of stuff about Muslims. There's a lot of stuff about Italy. There's an interesting stuff going on in Italy altogether. And then the third set of misinformation on the third dates we see in early April, it's almost completely taken over by religion. And that just shows how powerful the affective tug of believing that the misinformation is coming from a certain source. Essentially, you've gone from trying to think about how the situation can be cured to who can be blamed for the situation. And that's the interesting pattern in the misinformation that we are seeing in the early April period, when there's more and more despondency about whether there is a cure at all. Yeah. And of course, there's these two kinds of valence of misinformation. One thing that you've probably seen, that there's obviously the overwhelming kind of misinformation tends to be negative, which is like the image that you see on the left. But there's also a significant amount of positive misinformation. The biggest spike of positive misinformation happened right around the clapping at 5 o'clock, which was there was a lot of claims about this being scientific, and that clapping will get some energy into your hands and kill the germs on your hands and what have you and all that, and that this was actually also promoted by a number of influencers in society, stars and so on and so forth, who said that this was Modi's move to make people clap was actually rooted in some science and so on. All right. These are the thematic categories, and what we did basically is broke up the thematic categories with what were making word clouds of what were the key points being talked about for each of those. So in business and economy related stuff, they tended to be about essentials. Casualties obviously were about death and suffering. In doctored statistics, you see there is this whole number of things about fake positives, and in government related stuff, there's police. Police is the major object of misinformation, and as the lockdown happened and images of people being beaten by the police started getting around, there was also a lot of fake news about how police were handling things. And culture related things. This is this obviously shows you that the Chinese piece is almost like a tiny piece down here compared to Muslim related misinformation, which has become much more which had become much more significant. As I said, this analysis stops at the second week of April, and cure related stuff, of course, is about home remedies and all that. So I'm going to stop here. There's the point about operationalization of affect, which I've made already, which is that people have persistent attitudes, and they will continue to send out stories about those attitudes, even when they know that that story is highly unlikely to be to be true. Now, interestingly, this goes from political misinformation well into COVID misinformation as well. Is that when you're predisposed to believe something, you'll send it out, especially like in cure-related things. People will often say, "Well, this says that this following homeopathic remedy might help save you. What's the harm if I send this to somebody, especially if homeopathy doesn't do any harm to your body?" So if you're predisposed to believe something, you're likely to send that out, and the same thing moves over to culture as well. So